Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Zoom event. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Gail Presby. I'm the director of CLASA. That's the Carney Latin American Solidarity Archive. And very glad to bring you this event. And we have co-sponsors of this event, our Department of Political Science at University of Detroit Mercy, and we have Felicia Gray and Lee Dion from that department. They will be co-hosts for this event. And I want to also thank the Arthur McGovern Catholic Studies program for being a co-sponsor. So glad that you can all be here. I want to let you know that we'll be having presentations first. You will be able to use the chat to write your questions if you want one of us to ask the speakers questions. And you'll be able to raise your hand if you want to ask your question yourself in person. That will be for Q&A later in the session, but I wanted to let you know that would be a possibility for any of you. And so I wanted to start by telling you about our speakers today. This is the leadership team of an organization, Lex Innocentium 21. And I'd like to introduce Eamon Rafter. He's an activist and educator for peace and justice who works with World Beyond War, Swords into Plowshares, and Lex Innocentium 21, focusing on arms trade, militarism, war abolition, and nonviolent alternatives. And he's worked extensively on reconciliation projects in Ireland with schools, universities, and communities affected by conflict. He's an active participant and presenter in the International Institute of Peace Education, which has recently met in Mexico and Nepal. And that's where I've heard Eamon Rafter give very moving talks at those two institutes. And so glad that you could be with us. I'm very glad that you're able to have Marian Naughton join you. Marian Naughton, another of the team leaders of Lex Innocentium. She's a chartered educational psychologist, formerly with the HSE, now working in private practice. She's undertaken training in systemic family therapy, attachment therapy, narrative therapy. She has supported animal rights, peace and environmental initiatives over many years. And she recently attended the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine, Vienna. So we welcome both of you to our event, and now we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Gail, and thank you to CLASA and University of Detroit Mercy for the invitation to be here today. It's great to reconnect with you, and also it's great to have the opportunity to share some of the areas of the work that we've been involved in. And both myself and Marian have overlapped a little bit in our work. So, but we'll be dividing things up a little bit today. I'm going to start off by setting a context. We don't assume that you know a huge amount about Ireland for a start, especially since Ireland is such a little insignificant country. I say that perhaps ironically, because we believe Ireland has the ability or can play a major role internationally despite our size. But at the same time, many people would describe Ireland as a peripheral country. We're on the edge of Europe. We are a small island, um, and we are not known in any sense as a big global player in the perhaps in the more conventional sense of the term. So we're out on the edge of the Atlantic, and as we look across the Atlantic, its next stop is Newfoundland, North America. Uh, so yeah, we're delighted to talk to you today, and so I'm going to start off then by addressing some of the dimensions of Irish neutrality. Uh, Neutrality is perhaps not much spoken about these days, but we believe it can be uh, a really important alternative to the mainstream that's happening today. And given that we are living through, you know, certainly very uh, interesting times, I mean that in the sense that the times we're living in are challenging and uncertain, to say the very least. So let me start by talking a little bit about uh, where Irish neutrality comes in. So Ireland effectively was a British colony for almost 800 years. That's a long period. In the early 20s, Ireland became independent, remaining a dominion of Britain, but gradually moved to full independence and to be a republic. By 1937, um, we had a constitution, uh, and that constitution sort of sets out the terms of how the republic defines itself. Um, and of course, we are aware that countries with constitutions sometimes want to change these constitutions, or sometimes don't pay that much attention to the constitutions. And that can apply in different countries. The Irish Constitution very clearly sets out its sense of being committed to cooperation and international justice, uh, and affirms its adherence to the principles of the pacific settlement of international disputes. So basically, Ireland, in its constitution, defined itself as a country that would play an international role following the principles of international law. And in its relations with other states, Ireland would be a country that, as much as possible, would operate based on ideals of peace. Now, in the Constitution of 37, there's no actual mention of Ireland being neutral. So Ireland's formal, or sometimes we call it permanent, neutrality is not guaranteed. However, having said that, it's not mentioned in our constitution. Ireland has been formally, we might even say it's not formal, but however, formally, it has operated as a neutral state since the founding of the Republic. And that is actually kind of quite important to most Irish people. And whenever, even now, when we have a poll about Irish neutrality, it's usually 70+% of the Irish population that say we favour and want to be neutral. Now, what neutrality actually means, I'll come back to in a minute because it needs a little bit of definition. I don't assume everybody understands precisely what we mean. So I will come back to that in a minute. But for the moment, just uh, just to be clear together that it is part of our constitutional sense of Ireland as a peaceful nation and a nation that has deep respect for international law and wants to be a player and engaged with the institutions of international law. Okay, so let's move on then. Ireland is a divided country. Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom. And that's probably, about 1/4 of the size of the island of Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom. So the Republic of Ireland is the rest of the island, the major part of the island, with a population of about 5.5 million. However, in the early 70s, the Troubles broke out, and we had a violent conflict in Ireland, which really continued throughout the next 30 years. And that conflict was played out between people who wanted to remain, some of whom wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom, and others who wanted to be part of the Republic of Ireland. So we had a violent, ongoing situation uh, where you had the British Army on the ground, you had paramilitary organizations like the Irish Republican Army and other paramilitary organizations fighting what was basically a war, with ongoing killing, bombings, and the response, if you like, to British rule. Um, it's very interesting how we found a kind of working solution. It's not the end of the story, but in 1998, we had a peace agreement, and that peace agreement was called the Belfast Agreement, sometimes known as the Good Friday Agreement. Uh, it was uh, a, an agreement that came about through dialogue, which is again very important when we talk about conflict resolution in Ireland. It didn't come about by the victory or military victory of one side over the other. It came about by the different sides, and that meant the British government, the Irish government, the paramilitary, some of the paramilitary organizations, a women's group, the Women's Coalition, all coming together, sitting down and working through things. It was by no means a perfect solution. Um, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was a working solution, and effectively it meant that uh, there was now a possibility of resolving the conflictual situation, what we call the Troubles, through peaceful means. So, on the one hand, I would say there was still a lot to be done, but on the other hand, this agreement gave us the basis for building peace in Ireland. Um, the way I would usually put it is, if we look at peace as a process rather than a destination. So I would ask you to consider, a lot of people think, oh, we'll wake up one morning and we have peace and everything's wonderful. Uh, it doesn't really work like that. I would ask you to consider that peace is a process. So peace is not the station at the end, that you get off the train and come out and everything is wonderful. Peace is the train, is the way I would put it. And the mechanisms that we move forward are negotiation and dialogue, not weapons and killing. It's stated very clearly in the Good Friday Agreement. The quote I have here: "We reaffirm our total and absolute commitment to exclusively peaceful means of resolving differences on political issues, and our opposition to any use of threat or force by others for any political purpose, whether in regard to this agreement or otherwise." So this agreement refers to Northern Ireland, Ireland, I would say, and its relations with Britain too. Uh, Otherwise means what? I take otherwise to mean situations outside Ireland that are not necessarily within the island of Ireland. So the Good Friday Agreement seems to me, at least, to be saying we will resolve our differences by peaceful means on this island, but we are also committed to the peaceful resolution of conflict more generally and perhaps in a global situation. And that's very important from what I'm coming to next. The negotiations in Ireland led to an agreement that ended the 30 years of violent conflict in Northern Ireland. So violent means didn't lead to people getting what they were looking for. Uh, what violence in Ireland led to was more violence, which again, I would argue, is generally what violence breeds. Um, it doesn't bring us to uh, resolution in the sense of people's needs being met. It leads us very often to more and more violence. So clearly, according to the Good Friday Agreement, Ireland, North and South, was committed to using peaceful means. Certainly in 1998, that was what was stated. But what does it mean now? So let's just go on and look at where we are now. Um, the sharing lessons from the Irish peace process became, a very important thing after the Good Friday Agreement. The Irish government felt that this was, if not a perfect solution to conflict, at least we had something to share. Because in a world where conflict and violence is going on perpetually, um, perhaps Ireland had something to offer. Perhaps Ireland could point ways forward and suggest to other places where intractable conflicts were happening that negotiation and dialogue are key to resolving conflict. Of course, in Ireland, there were legacy issues around around what had happened, what was left after the conflict. There was the release of prisoners, there was getting rid of weapons. All these things had to be done. There was a change of police force. There were all the relations between North and South. These all had to be worked out. We call these legacy issues, and they still needed to be managed. They're still not all sorted out. There's still things there that we need to work in. But what was very important, and still today is very important, no one wanted or suggested a return to violence because people understood what the implication of violence was. They understood what the costs of violence was, and people on all sides of the conflict said, we don't want to go back to that. So that meant stay with the process, work with the process, engage and continue to engage. And even when there are difficulties, we still have to find ways forward through peaceful negotiation. Meanwhile, the Irish government was very active in issues like global nuclear disarmament, and Ireland played not not the biggest role, but a significant role, I would say, in the treaty for prohibition of nuclear weapons back in 2017, I think it was. A small country, we're non-nuclear, we don't have nuclear power, we certainly don't have nuclear weapons, but a small country saying disarmament has to be part of the future, and we learned this as well through our own conflict. As a member of the European Union, Ireland remained neutral, didn't join NATO. We're still not a member of NATO. And our neutrality, which meant we were not part of military alliances, not formally part of any military alliance, was guaranteed what we call the triple lock. And basically, the triple lock in Ireland is a mechanism that requires the United Nations mandate for the deployment of significant numbers of Irish troops abroad. So we could basically say Irish troops have never been sent abroad in significant numbers except on United Nations peacekeeping missions, which generally speaking in Ireland have the support of the citizens of Ireland. The blue berets of the UN are considered uh, a good use of Irish soldiers. Um, However, there are people who might like that to change. And there are many who think that Ireland should be playing a bigger role in military blocs. So as we go through the early years of 21st century, it was noticeable that militarism in the European Union was gaining currency. European Union is often defined as a peace project. Uh, and ideally speaking, it was a project, and which came out of, the ruins, if you like, of the Second World War. However, again, we would argue uh, its engagement with peace has somehow lost its bearing, and militarism within the European Union has gained huge currency, and the resources and financing of military means and arms and weapons has hugely increased within the European Union. So Ireland remains one of the very few neutral countries. Ourselves, Austria, Malta, neutrality is nowadays considered, maybe you shouldn't be doing that anymore. Maybe you should get on board. And certainly with the war in Ukraine, intensified this process where Ireland has been under pressure to abandon its neutrality or even to water down its neutrality. And by that I mean uh, to sort of say we can say we are formally neutral, but in many ways we abandon our neutrality if it suits, which again is one of the things that we're advocating against. I would say strongly that Irish neutrality is very important to our sense of who we are as a people, our post-colonial, if you like, identity, and it has very deep Gaelic roots, which I think Marian will come back to that. Uh, this wasn't something that just came out of nowhere. Irish people have a sense of fairness and justice, which I think has come very, very much out of our troubled history, maybe as an understatement. And you can see this in Ireland's response to Gaza, where Ireland as a country has generally been very supportive of ending ceasefire in Gaza and also demanding a just peace for the Palestinian people. Much to the disdain of many European countries who seem to think that increasing arms to Israel is the way to go. That's generally not been the response from Irish people, and the Irish government has been at some points critical, but we would argue not active enough in taking in measures to support a just peace. But neutrality does not, and this is very important, it doesn't mean indifference in the face of oppression. We're not sitting on the fence here and saying, okay, we're opting out, we're not doing anything. Neutrality for us means a policy, a foreign policy guided by values as much as interest. So it's not just about our self-interest. If we stay out of trouble, we can do well. Um, we believe in an engaged and active neutrality whereby Ireland can play a role as a peacemaker in the world. And it seems right now that a role like this is very necessary. A country that had a long history of being colonized knows what it's like to be colonized and therefore could take a different position in the world and advocate peace and try to bring about uh, opportunities for dialogue and structures that might be more on the side of building a peaceful and just world, and also protecting our environment globally, which we think is one of the major threats that we face in the modern world. However, Ireland's neutrality is now being undermined, especially with, as I mentioned, with the war in Ukraine and the direction of travel in Europe. We also have the use of Shannon Airport in Ireland, in the west of Ireland. It's been used for a number of years by the US military, who use it as a stop off. It's not formally an American base, but it's used as an American base. Uh, this is a breach of our neutrality, and we for a number of years we have demanded that this practice be stopped. PESCO, which is one of the European Union military vehicles, if you like, And again, the NATO expansion and use of some facilities and Ireland's increasing engagement in connection with NATO has made a mockery of our neutrality. Irish peace organizations like the ones we're involved in really we feel it's very important to defend Irish neutrality. Maybe defend is a militarized term. Maybe we should be active in trying to save it. It would be more realistic to talk about because it's under serious threat. Um, we we try to make our commitment to a culture of peace uh, and counter warmongering by asserting the value and potential of Irish neutrality and neutrality generally. Um, we do not want to join the war bandwagon, and we see our global role as sharing our commitment to the potential of peaceful means. So, in so saying, just to conclude, we are actively involved. Here we have the shamrock, which you'll be familiar with, but perhaps here you'll see it displayed in ways you haven't seen before. On the left is a poster or a badge, if you like, uh, looking for or calling for ways to save the triple lock and protect Irish neutrality, with a special reference to the importance of the United Nations. We believe now is the time to support the United Nations, not the time to abandon the United Nations. We see the undermining of the UN in many parts of the world. We think the UN is worth getting on board with and can play a huge role in building peace. On the right, we have the black shamrock, which is an Irish symbol of peace, which came about from the Irish shamrock is usually brought to the White House on St. Patrick's Day. And we find it problematic that our shamrock has been shared with a number of presidents who advocate war as the solution to the problems of the world. The Black Shamrock says, not in our name. We do not want the shamrock used as a symbol of war. And this particular Black Shamrock, you may notice, has the colors of Palestine. Uh, I will finish on that and leave you to think about it. Welcome any questions you might ask. And I'll pass on to Marian. So thank you. And Marian, I think you're muted. So
I'm on now. Okay. Um, thanks, Eamon, and thanks, Gail and Felicia and Lee for having us. It's really absolutely super to share an event like this. I checked today, and you are 3,538 miles to the west of us. And thank goodness you know how to work the technology. I don't, because the technology is allowing us to have this evening, and it's really super. We are a tiny, tiny island, offshore Europeans, and I think our offshoredness is a great asset for us. It gives us time and space to double think and to double check what's going on in Europe before we dive in. And I think that that's a great asset for us to have. Um, I'm I'm one of the organizers of Lex Innocentium, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, if that's okay. Eamon has set out the sort of the political picture and the struggles for Irish people who want to maintain neutrality and who want to present themselves as peace brokers and friends to all and to all on both sides of conflicts. That's the role we see for ourselves. And we have developed our peace initiative in keeping with those wishes of the majority of Irish people. Our peace initiative is called Lex Innocentium 21st Century, or Lex Innocentium 21 for short. It's based on an ancient Irish law. And Eamon mentioned our kind of Gaelic past. We were known once as the Island of Saints and Scholars, and that stems back to the early Irish church, the Christian church, and the mixture of our former Christianity, our paganism, with our Christianity gave us a great sense of love and forgiveness and peace for humanity, and also a respect for the earth, because our ancestors were very attached to the earth. So that's where we're coming from. So the original Lex Innocentium was written in the year 697 AD. So it is over 1,000 years old. And it was written by an Irish monk called Adofnan. And Adofnan, I'll just point to the picture you see there. Lex Innocentium 21st century is a people's law. It's a civilian's law. It's not a state law. And so people sign this law. And in the previous picture, you saw Eamon himself signing the law. Now, the original law was in the year 697 AD, and it was written by Adofnan, and there he is in the center of the painting. Adofnan was an Irish monk. He was born in County Donegal in around the year 628, and Donegal is in the northwest of Ireland, and Adofnan was born to the same family as Saint Columcille, and that was a noble Irish family. And in following in Columcille's footsteps, Adofnan became a monk, and he became the 9th abbot of Iona. Iona is a tiny, tiny island off the west coast of Scotland, so it's between Ireland and Scotland. And Columcille had set up an abbey there 100 years before Adofnan's time. And Iona was a centre, a very important centre for the early Irish church. The Irish had gone across the sea to Scotland and into northern England, not in an aggressive way, but actually in a missionary way to spread Christianity and learning. And so the Irish church was very, very influential in all across Scotland and northern England. So in the year, Adofnan was also a relation of the High King of Ireland, so he was very well connected. And he also had a great reputation within the church and within civil society. At one time, he acted as an ambassador in the negotiations for the release of hostages between the King of Tara and the King of Northumbria in England. So he was very well got in social circles as well. And in the year 697 AD, Adofnan called a synod in the town of Birr in County Offaly, which is in the centre of Ireland. And because he was so well regarded and because he was so well connected, he was in a position to invite the civil leaders and the church leaders from all across Ireland, Scotland, and Northern England. And at that synod in Birr in 697 AD, Adofnan presented his law, Lex Innocentium. And Lex Innocentium means the law of the innocents. And in his law, Adofnan declared it a crime to kill women, children, clergy, and those in the protection of the church, namely non-combatants and penitents. So they made it a law that you could not kill women, children, or clergy or non-combatants in war. And the law was signed by 91 kings, abbots, and bishops from all over the two islands. And it became a law for the whole of Ireland and Britain. And it was actually the first law of its kind in Europe. It was in being a law that identified a specific group of non-combatants and guaranteed protection for them in war. And so sometimes the law is referred to as the First Geneva Convention. 697 AD, the first Geneva Convention, or the Geneva Convention of the Gaels, of the Irish and Scots people. So the history starts, there are three important dates in the history of Lex Innocentium, 21st century. And the first one is the early summer of 697 AD in Birr at the launch of the original law. And then the next important date is the winter of the year 628 to 29. And then the third date is the 21st of September, 2024. And the law begins with Adofnan writing, or the history begins with Adofnan writing his law in 697 AD. And how's the law? We don't have any record of how long the law lasted in effect across the two islands, but there have been cases in the history where it was referred to where people broke Adofnan's law and were penalised for it. So it went on for quite a long time, and it was certainly known in the history of Ireland over 1,000 years. Because almost 1,000 years later, in the early 1600s, when Ireland was becoming more and more under the control of Britain, and we were on the brink of losing our old Gaelic ways, our old Gaelic order, and losing our identity as the Gaels. A Franciscan monk, Micheál O'Clery, who was based at the Irish College in Louvain in Belgium, was sent back to Ireland. There's the gateway there to the college in Louvain. Micheál O'Clery was sent back to Ireland with three of his colleagues to collect the history of Irish saints, Irish civil history, and Irish laws as we were becoming more and more a colony of Britain, because the school in Louvain, the Irish College, was afraid that the Irish would forget who they were, who they had been before they lost their identity under British rule. And so O'Clery and his three colleagues, we know them as the Four Masters, in the early 1600s, travelled the length and breadth of Ireland, gathering up and copying out ancient history, the history of the saints, and all of our laws, to bring them back to the college in Louvain, where they could be kept for us until such time as we could become our own independent country again and remember who we were. But before he went back to Louvain, Micheál O'Clery wanted to clarify a few points of law in relation to Adofnan's law with Flann Mac Éagon of the Bardic lawyer family, the Eagons at Redwood Castle. And that's Redwood Castle there in the picture as it is today. It has been restored. So the Eagons were a famous medieval Irish legal family, and they were legal advisors to all the kings and the chieftains at that time, and they kept a record of all the Brehon laws and interpreted them for people. So Micheál O'Clery came to Redwood Castle in the winter of the year 1628, and he spent a few nights there discussing Adofnan's Lex Innocentium with Flann Mac Éagon, so that he had a proper understanding of the law before he brought it back to Louvain, where it was then included in the Annals of Ireland. And that copy of the law can still be seen. It's in the Bibliothèque Royale in Brussels. Now, the copy of the law that Micheál O'Clery brought to discuss with Flann Mac Éagon was a copy of a 10th or 12th century version of the law. After Adofnan died, the law was copied out several times and revised. And so what we have now is not entirely all Adofnan's law. There have been additions to it. For example, Adofnan's penalties were all non-violent penalties. They were usually very heavy fines, but after he died, other writers wrote penalties into the law that were violent physical penalties. Luckily for us, the scholars are able to tell us which parts of the law are Adamnan's original text and which were added on, and they can do that by analysing the language. Adamnan wrote in Old Irish, and they could tell by the language, the vocabulary, the phrasing, and the imagery in the writing what the actual original law was. And certainly there was no violent penalties in that law. So then Adamnan's law went across to Louvain to be stored, and we came more and more under British rule. And a lot has happened since Adamnan's time and since Micheál O'Cleary's time in 1628. Ireland now, as Eamon said, we've got full independent jurisdiction over 26 of the 32 counties, and the Northern Ireland Agreement looks after Northern Ireland and how it is managed. And since those early times, all across Europe and indeed all across the world, we have seen a great many wars. And war is always terrible, no matter what side you're on. And now, in our time, we have weapons of horrendous power. We have weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons. At the flick of a switch, we can kill by the hundreds of thousands. And we even now have the power to destroy life on Earth as we know it. And it was with this in mind that a group of us got together last year. We began on St. Patrick's Day and revised Adamnan's law to extend his protection to all of humanity, to Mother Earth herself in her own right, with all her beautiful and extraordinary ecosystems and living creatures, and also to the future generations of humanity who aren't here to speak for themselves, and the future of the Earth herself. In her own right, because even if we do manage to annihilate ourselves in crazy wars, the earth has a right to survive, and our fellow creatures have a right to survive. So what we have now is an updated version of Adamnan's Lex Innocentium. We have Lex Innocentium 21st century, and it extends protection from the scourge of war to all of humanity, to the earth, and to the future. We launched the law on the 21st of September 2024, which is the United Nations International Day of Peace. And we also chose that date because the 23rd of September is Adamnan's feast day. So it was the Saturday of the weekend of Adamnan's feast day. We feel that this law is very much in keeping with our Constitution, Article 29. It's a peacekeeping law. It's a law of non-violence. It's a law of settling resolution by peaceful means. And so we're very comfortable with the law. On the day that we signed the law, we signed it we had our conference in Birr, and where the original law was launched, and then we went to Redwood Castle to sign the law because Redwood is just a few miles outside Birr. And at the launch, our signatures were witnessed by Miss Colisa Egan, who is a descendant of Flann Mac Egan, or Flann Egan, who discussed the law with Michael O'Cleary in 1628. So we had a beautiful historical connection with the original law. The law is written in 4 parts. There's the law itself, setting out how it's a crime. There's a summary of it there. It's a crime to hurt innocent people. It's a crime to injure their crops, their livestock, and even their domestic pets. It's a crime to force human beings to witness violence, cruelty, and killing. It's a crime to damage the spirit of humanity by carrying out acts of violence and war. It's a crime to waste resources on war. And it's a crime to force others to commit acts of violence and war against their beliefs, against their religion, against their principles. And so that's our law. And also in the law, we have a penalties document. The penalties are all moral, emotional penalties: shame, sadness, remorse, regret. And we have restitutions, and all of the restitutions that we recommend for people who have broken our law are direct restitutions to the victims of law by way of compensation, remediation, therapy, medical treatments, and rebuilding of their infrastructure and their homes, replanting of their crops, and restocking their livestock. Restitutions to Mother Earth, rewilding the planet, setting up national parks and things like that. And then restitutions to the future, setting up peace projects, setting up institutions of peace, whereby future generations can study peace and learn to settle their conflicts by peaceful means. And the law also contains a letter to future generations, whereby we tell them that we're worried, that we're anxious, and that we hope that they're okay, and that the earth is okay, that we haven't done too much harm in our time, and hoping for them that they have better ways of resolving conflict than we do right now. All of these documents are on the website, together with a copy of the history of how we came by this law. And I should say too, at Redwood, when we signed the law, at the very same time, there were people signing the law in Scotland and people signing the law in England. So we kept the law truly international, as it was a law for the two islands. In the first law, we kept the same countries signing the law the second time round. So we are inviting people all across Ireland and all across the world to sign Lex Innocentium on the website. There were 81 official signatories on the day of the launch. You saw Eamon, he was one of them, he signed the law. But now we're asking people all around the world to sign the law on our website and to become signatories of Lex Innocentium. It's a people's law. We are citizen legislators. It's not a state law or an international law organized by states. We do have international law for the conduct of war, but we've all seen, tragically in recent times, that international laws for the conduct of war are broken and ignored on a regular basis. So this is a citizen law. You sign this, and in signing it, you are saying to world leaders, this is the kind of world we want, not a world of war. And so when you go on the website, if you'd like to sign the law, you can sign your name, and then you can download, you get a signatory number. We all have our own number, and you can download a signatory's certificate in Irish, in English, or in Spanish. We're working on other languages too. And then what we're hoping is that obviously the more signatures we have, the better, the louder our voice. And we're hoping that then when people become signatories to Lex Innocentium, when they talk to their leaders, their politicians, when they write letters to the press, when they speak on social media, they can say, I am a signatory to Lex Innocentium 21st Century. I am not in my own in these views. I speak with the support of all of the other signatories in calling for peace and justice throughout the world. And just before I finish, I wanted to mention to you another person who was important, we believe, in the history of Lex Innocentium, and that is Adovnan's mother. Her name was Ronat, and the story has it that she was very influential in getting Adovnan to write the original Lex Innocentium. One of the stories tell us that Adovnan and his mother Ronat were traveling together, and they came upon the aftermath of the Battle of Brega, which happened in the year 680 something, 686. And they came upon the body of a young mother murdered in the battle, and on her breast, her dead infant, with mother's milk pouring from one side of its mouth and blood from the other. And Ronat said to Adafnan, "You must promise me that you will do something to protect the women and children of Ireland." And Adafnan promised. And hence Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocents, the law of the people who do no harm. And while we can't ever verify that story, and the date is a little bit iffy because Adafnan would have already been in his late 50s by the time the Battle of Brega happened. But we do believe that Adafnan's mother, Ronat, was influential in his thinking, in his beliefs, and in his philosophy. So we're very appreciative of this Irish mother and the influence she had on the history of peace and non-violence that we have on the island. So that's a run through, but you can pick up on any of it and the story of it on the website. It's all there, and you can download PDF versions of the documents.
Thanks, Marian.
Thank
Just
you.
yeah, to conclude, from both of us, I would again, I'd encourage people to go and have a deeper read and look at Lex Innocentium. But in conclusion, I was going to tie a little bit the two parts of our presentation, because we feel they're deeply, deeply connected. We're living in a world now that, as far as I'm aware, well, this is one figure I've been given, there are 55 serious violent conflicts going on in various parts of the world. And, there's a politics of fear that dominates international relations. Laws about war and laws that might seek to prevent war are being ignored. And this politics of fear, which leads to violence and militarism and more violence, has become more and more pervasive. So what both our presentations are asking people to look at is the whole notion of, let's say, a world beyond war, a world where war is no longer the default position. We believe in the need for the abolition of war. Of course, that's a huge, huge task, but we would encourage everyone here today to think about these things. I'm an educator primarily, so my mission is to try and bring some of these processes and ideas to people to think about and engage with. So we hope that you will think about these things, and we hope that you might have a couple of things to ask us or questions you might like to pose. So again, thanks to you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Eamon and Marian, for that very interesting presentation, very challenging and inspirational, drawing upon the history as you did and applying it to today. So at this point, we're going to have some Q&A. Quite a few attendees have already put some questions in the chat, so we'll go through those. I also want to mention, if you want to ask your question yourself, you can raise your hand. Please note, though, we are recording this, so your identity may be known in the recording if you raise your hand. So if that's okay with you, no problem. The chats in the webinar, we can just read the questions without mentioning the authors, although panelists, you can see the authors of the questions. And I'll be taking turns along with Dr. Gray and Dr. Dion, reading some of these questions. The first question is a nice big question. Do you think the principles of the Good Friday Agreement could work in resolving other conflicts such as Ukraine and Palestine? So you mentioned 55 conflicts, and I'm sure each one of them is a big challenge, but on everybody's mind are these two conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine. How does Lex Innocentium help us to respond to a situation like this?
Well, maybe I'll take the Good Friday part of the question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that sharing learning from the Irish conflict was very, very important in the early 2000s, and it was felt that that was something Ireland could offer the world. The conflict, which we call the Troubles, which is kind of euphemism, but in Ireland, when I was growing up, it was believed that it was a conflict that would never end. That's what people would say. This will go on forever. That was the normal discourse. It will never end because the killing on one side, killing on the others, all kinds of tit for tat, revenge killings. So I grew up with that notion that this was something that was going, it had gone on for 30 years and it would always go on. But of course, people at some point become fatigued and perhaps they get smart, or they begin to understand that more of the same is not going to provide a solution. And people being killed and then killing in revenge and so on. And again, actions of governments, which I think is very important too, that perpetuate this, will never provide a solution. So finally, in Northern Ireland, it was decided by people who were, there were people who were taking huge risks, but they promoted the idea of dialogue. They began to initiate dialogue in a very small way. And that gradually grew and built, and more people got involved. So if any lesson comes out of that, I would say it's the notion that at some point in any situation of conflict, there is going to have to be a willingness to talk. And, it's far better if people get that idea before, the killing, it just becomes completely, off the radar in terms of numbers. You could argue that that's happened already in Ukraine. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being killed. But I do think that people begin to understand that negotiations are going to be necessary. And in a negotiation situation, there's going to have to be room for compromise. There's going to have to be trade-off, and not everybody will get what everybody wants. So obviously that's one of the lessons of a conflict that results in an agreement. One of the problems with that is the agreement is only the beginning. The implementation of the agreement is a huge, huge challenge. But we learned in Ireland that a willingness to engage in dialogue is the only way we're ever going to make progress. Now, in the case of Ireland, the United States was considered an honest broker and was very helpful in creating the atmosphere for dialogue. So that's something that we need in any conflict situation. Is the United States going to be able to do that in Ukraine, in the UK and Russian situation? We'll see. Certainly, in the context of Gaza, that would be perhaps a more difficult, but we need some mediation, somebody that has an ability to build trust and engage with the different sides of the conflict. So that's one thing we learned in Ireland, and I think it might seem obvious to some people, and yet how long it takes to get there and how many people get killed in the process. That's what we need to address.
Mhm. Thank you for that answer, Eamon. So this question was written while you were presenting, but I guess both you and Marian could take a shot at it. It's general, but I guess you could make it a little specific to the context of your presentation would be, what would be some recommendations that you have for Ireland at this point, considering, the threats to its neutrality or having this people-centered law? What might be some recommendations that you have?
Well, if I can answer that or try to, um, I I would be very keen for Ireland to remain a neutral country, um, and to proceed as a neutral country. There's not much point in us becoming a military country. We're too small. We could never afford the kinds of weapons our adversaries would have. And we couldn't possibly defend ourselves if we were attacked by even a relatively small power. So I think Ireland's power is a soft power and a gentle power. And I think in the end, the soft power will be the stronger one because, as Eamon said, all conflicts have to come to the table at some point. The longer you go on fighting, the more dead you have on both sides, the more difficult it is then for the survivors of both sides to reconciliate because they feel disloyal to the people who have died. And it gets very complicated. And I feel if we kept ourselves neutral, didn't have the baggage of having taken sides, we can offer ourselves as absolutely independent peace brokers with no baggage. And I think one of the things that people ask about this is that how can you be neutral in a situation where one side looks like it's really bad and the other side looks like it's the victim? And you can, in fact, because, if you bring it into your own personal life and into one-to-one relationships even, it is your best friend is the one who's going to be brave enough and courageous enough to tell you when you're doing something wrong. And your best friend trusts to the strength of your relationship that you'll take that on the chin and act accordingly. And if Ireland can be, we are committed to friendly international relationships. We are committed to being the friend of other countries. And so, I can go into a conflict situation between two of my friends and say, well, look, Eamon, you were wrong what you said there. I can see why Mary is offended and you need to think about what you did. Why not? Can't we do that in international relations and say, you need to pull back, whatever you feel your cause is, whatever you feel has been done to you, your behavior is not acceptable and it's not going to help the situation. I remember listening to Margaret Thatcher in a speech saying, that's out, that's out, that's out, and thinking, well, I feel like joining the IRA myself now. There's no point in making enemies and causing the other side to hate you all the more or to have to be loyal to the people you killed. So I would say neutrality does not require us to be blind to the wrong behavior of somebody. It requires us to be able to point out the wrongdoings, but stay loyal in friendship to both parties, even the people doing wrong, and say, because I'm your friend, I want you to restore yourself to goodness. I want you to restore yourself to dignified behavior. I want you to restore yourself to being a civilized nation among civilized nations. And I'm saying this to you because I want to be your friend. So neutrality is a form of friendship, honest friendship, that's not afraid to say when you're in the wrong.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, we tend to talk about neutrality very much as a non-violent alternative. I mean, there are people who think that neutrality can be a militarized neutrality as well. However, I mean, I would be arguing for a neutrality that actually builds a deeper understanding of, the problem of violence, and looks at, militarized security as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We're often accustomed to thinking that, the weapon of the strong is a military weapon. I would argue that that is a weapon of the weak, and that non-violence or non-violent approaches are actually a weapon of the strong, because you have to be strong to face the challenges in the world in a way other than by violence. We are always, frequently, constantly told that, more weapons and more arms make us safer. This is a constant mantra, that security comes through the barrel of guns. And certainly what's happening now, and there's a question there, I think, that asks about this in Europe. We're now being encouraged, partly by the United States, but also internally in Europe, to increase our spending on defense, and that this will make us more safe somehow. There's no evidence whatsoever in history that more weapons make anyone safer. When having weapons makes the use of weapons more likely, and you just think about that from your own context, wherever you're living. Guns do not really make us safer. I mean, there's no evidence that they do. So we're looking at neutrality as just a different approach to security. And it takes strength to opt out of violent mechanisms. It takes courage. It's a risk. So I personally also hope that Ireland can get through this very difficult time, and hold on to our neutral status, and not even just hold on to it. It would be great to think it could be really valued as a way of working in the world, as a way of, trying to be influential in different ways. I'm not of the opinion that we are the good guys and someone else is the bad guys. The world is much more complex. There's much more gray in the world, and things are not that simple. But if people or countries actually make different choices about the use of weapons and violence, I think we have a chance. I think also the global environment, which we touched on briefly, but is very, very important, I think, certainly to both of us and the work that we do. The environment has a better chance of making it too. And ultimately, we want to live in a world which is safe, but also in which the air we breathe and the water we drink are part of our nourishment. So neutrality is not that, it's not going to bring us everything we need, but it allows us to see the complexity, and to have an engagement with the different sides. So I think that's very important.
All right, we've got our next question here is, how do you determine the ethical limits of neutrality? So in this case, I would imagine that the question might be getting at, and the person who asked it can correct me, but the idea that, for example, I would imagine, is there an obligation, for example, to defend innocents from aggression, that sort of a thing, and how does that interact with some of these obligations?
I think we're all entitled to a defense, against assault. However, it still seems that conflict prevention is an area that we need to put a lot more resources into. So, for example, the amount of money we spend on weapons versus the amount of money we spend on peace building mechanisms, and prevention of conflict in the first place. So, I mean, if people had better chances and options in the countries they live in for to live normal lives, there might be less instinct to use aggression to achieve your own validation and your own rights. But of course, in supporting and defending neutrality, we're not saying that, come in and walk all over us. That's okay. I mean, there's an ethical obligation of every country to defend their people at whatever level. But what we're saying is that military defense is not the only option. And, if we could manage the conflicts first that we face, and perhaps, because when I speak about conflict, I do training in working with conflict. I distinguish between conflict and violence. Conflict can go many different ways. It can be resolved before there's any violence. But if we fail to address it or work with it in some way, very often on a prolonged situation, it gets closer and closer to violence. When it does get closer to violence, it's harder to resolve. Which again goes back to what I said at the beginning. If we put more resources for a start into peace building. I mean, we spend a tiny, tiny proportion on peace building resources than we do on war making resources. But also, just to finish on that, the word defense now, again, is a word that's been used, I think, incorrectly. In many countries, we have departments of defense that spend most of their time in offense. So the word defense, as far as I'm aware, I think it's the case in the United States. I think until the end of the Second World War, the department in question was called the Department of War. Am I right about that? Or the Department of, and it was changed to the Department of Defense. We have the same thing in Ireland. We have a Department of Defense, which is responsible for our army. So yeah, I mean, defense literally is a perfectly valid thing, but when it's actually used to mean building an arsenal to attack other countries, that's not defense. So I think we need to understand the difference between defense and wars of aggression and wars of, resource theft, etc.
Yes, and here in Ireland, at the moment, our government is insisting on increasing our expenditure on defence very, very significantly, and that's coming under pressure from Europe. And the answer is we're actually not at war with anybody. We have no enemies. We have never invaded anybody or attacked anybody. And unless we line up with somebody who has enemies, there's nobody has any call to attack us. And the amount of money we're being asked to spend on defense makes no sense in that context when we do need to spend money on health, education, and housing, and on protecting the the natural environment. So this notion of more and more and more and more money on defense, it just results in an arms race and lining the pockets of the military industrial complex. I mean, that's what we're doing, really. We don't need that much defense, and we've no intentions of going to war with anyone unless some of our friends or so called friends drag us into war, which is why we are trying to stay neutral so we don't get into that.
Yeah, and just I would add to that, we often hear people saying, "Oh, war doesn't benefit anybody," but in actual fact, it does. it significantly benefits people financially who are involved in the military industrial complex, the manufacturers of weapons. Look at the increase in the share price of the biggest arms companies in the world, the Lockheed Martins, Raytheons, British Aerospace, Rheinmetall, the German arms manufacturer, has increased their share price by multiples because they've sold so many weapons since the beginning of the Ukraine war. So while we are familiar with the costs of war and the costs of violence, we need to be aware that war creates profit, and that this profit is so immense that the people involved are very reluctant to give up their share of it. So, you know, there's benefits to financial benefits to the waging of war. And that's, to my mind, the most cynical aspect, if you like, of war, waging war for profit.
We're running out of time, but I want to give you all just one last chance to respond to what you would like out of a group of questions. So we've had a lot of great questions, and I'm just going to mention several that so far have not been asked and give each of you a chance to address which ones you'd like, and then we will conclude. So I hope that's okay with our audience, if you can remain for this last round of questions. Now I have 5 questions. They're all different from each other. You don't have to answer them all, just whatever moves you. Is there any relationship between Irish neutrality and the non-aligned movement, which was a big international movement that some countries participated in? That's one. Another question is, what does it mean when you say harming the heart, the soul, and the spirit? Another asks, how does your statement apply to the current problems of refugees? Another refers to Catherine Macaulay from the Sisters of Mercy, who is very important in our university. We're founded by the Jesuits and the Sisters of Mercy. And the students wonder, what is the role of faith in coming to these insights or acting upon them? And then lastly, since you mentioned Ronat, what about the role of women in modern peace efforts? So I want to thank our audience for all these questions and give you one last chance to address any of them that you would like.
I'll start, if you like, with the question about the heart, soul, and spirit of humanity, because that's written into the law, Lex Innocentium. What we're saying there is that it diminishes all of us when we choose violence over higher order human skills for resolving conflict. We're I'm a developmental educational psychologist, and so when I work with children, I am aware that they are on a journey from infancy to adulthood, gaining in skills, meeting developmental milestones, and moving forward always. And I think humanity is also on a developmental pathway. And that's reflected in many of our religions. We talk about the fall, we talk about getting closer to our creator, we talk about becoming more like whoever made us, a better form of ourselves. And I think that we should, as a species, aim to be better and better and better. And I think, without sounding judgmental about it, I think that discussing your problems is a higher order of problem resolution than boxing one another around the place over it. And so I feel that to go to war pulls us all back into a less developed version of ourselves, that we should all be better than that. And so when you resort to violence, you hurt me, you hurt my species, you drag us back into a darker time. And that's why we wrote that into the law.
Yeah, there are probably a few things I could say. I mean, I don't know if we can answer everything that we were asked, but maybe in relation to the question about the non-aligned movement, maybe I can say a little there. Yes, neutrality and non-alignment are definitely related. I think neutrality needs to go further than non-alignment. You know, to be non-aligned is part of neutrality, but neutrality, the way we're speaking about it, is very much a more active process. If we look at the history of the non-aligned movement, which, you know, was really offered at the height of the Cold War, offered an alternative approach, which kind of said, okay, we're not on one side or the other. We're not on the side of the Soviet Union. We're not on the side of the American and European, the NATO bloc. We're something else. But the difficulty then with the non-alignment movement was, how could they have an active role in the world when, you know, certainly Western powers were saying, well, if you're not with us, you're against us. And that's part of the difficulty around that concept of non-alignment. You know, we are often told, for example, in Ireland, that we're pro-Putin because you know, because we stand for neutrality. But you know, it again, that it's just ridiculous, because we're not we're not taking that side, and we're not taking the side of, you know, the other, nor are we saying we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. So non-alignment definitely has a lot, and it's really worth looking at the history of the non-aligned movement. It's not over, by the way. I do think that what the non-aligned movement really offers us is a way to connect with the global South, which is very, very important. And you know, in terms of that, you know, we asked the question, could Ireland be part of the contemporary non-aligned movement, and take the side of the global South, if you like, the poorer nations of the earth, or would it be hypocritical because Ireland is, in fact, you know, not the richest country in the world, but certainly, you know, Western European country of, you know, certain economic status. But I do think that in Ireland, there's still a lot of connection and solidarity with the global South. And I think that's a place we could look for, you know, reference points between neutrality and non-alignment. It's certainly one way to understand neutrality, but I think it's not enough.
Yeah, I agree. If you like, I might say something about the question about faith. I think faith is a very important ingredient in this and in our development as a species too. And I'm not pinning faith down to any one particular religion, but to have faith in something bigger than ourselves or outside of ourselves that sets up goals and imagined selves that are better than what we are right now. I was very moved by our experience after we set up Lex Innocentium, because, you know, it was nothing for an Irish person educated in a convent school to find that something that was influencing me came out of the early Irish church. I happen to really like the early Irish church because I loved its closeness to nature and its respect for nature. And I loved its humanity and its sharing of itself without violence. So I feel very comfortable with the early Irish church and that golden period in our history. And I felt very comfortable about rewriting an old religious based law in a way, Lex Innocentium. But what I found very moving after we launched the law was the number of religious people who signed the law, sisters, priests, bishops, signing in great numbers, they saw something in there that matched their feelings, their instincts, and their beliefs. And they found a home in the law and a way of expressing their views in the law. And I was very moved and honoured by their signing of the law, because I think it meant something to them. And from what I've experienced since we launched the law, is that I actually believe that the people who will save humanity will be the indigenous peoples of the global south, and their love of their land and nature, and their love of their ancestors, and also the religious people, because of their convictions and their commitment to living a higher order way of life. So I think faith is huge. Without faith in something, in some better version of ourselves, whether it's attached to a particular God or just that we are an incredible species evolving into something better, I think faith is very important.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us to the end. We've learned so much. I've learned so much. And your movement is so inspiring. I hope we can help to spread its message around the world. Attendees, you heard about the website, the chance to sign. Please consider that. And so thank you again, Eamon and Marian. Thank you, Felicia and Lee and Political Science Department, and also Catholic Studies Program. And join us again for events. Anybody in Detroit on campus, the rest of our events will be in person in April on our campus. But insofar as we could reach a broad audience across the miles for this Zoom webinar, we are so grateful that you were able to join us. And so on that note, I want to wish everybody a good rest of their day. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a million. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
afternoon.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.